I never imagined my husband's death would divide our family so completely, or that his final act would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the life we'd built together. The morning of the will reading was cold and brittle, like the air itself had forgotten how to breathe. My children, Evan and Lila, sat across from me in the mahogany-paneled office, their faces calm, unreadable. I remember thinking how poised they looked, how distant. The attorney, a thin man with spectacles too large for his face, cleared his throat as though preparing to deliver a eulogy rather than a legal statement. According to Mr. Lawson's final testament, he began, the estate shall be divided as follows. I didn't hear the next part. My ears filled with the soft roar of disbelief as the numbers, $12 million, rolled off his tongue. Each child, $6 million. I stared at my clasped hands, waiting for my name to follow. When it did, it wasn't what I expected. For Mrs. Lawson, the attorney continued, sliding an envelope across the polished desk, your husband left this. A letter, cream-colored. My name written in his looping script. Beneath it, taped to the back, a small silver key. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with something I couldn't yet name. Pity, confusion, maybe judgment. Evan looked away. Lila's hand tightened around her designer purse. I forced a smile I didn't feel. A letter, I said softly, my voice trembling despite my effort to steady it. How thoughtful. The attorney avoided my eyes. Mr. Lawson was very specific in his instructions. He said you'd understand. Understand what? My husband had been a man of precision, of balance, never one for riddles. In 32 years of marriage, he'd given me everything from pearls to promises, but never mystery. That key, though. It gleamed beneath the sterile light, small yet unbearably significant. I wanted to ask what it opened, a safe, a drawer, a memory perhaps, but pride stopped me. Instead, I slipped the envelope into my handbag, pretending it meant more than it did. After the reading, my children hugged me out of obligation. Evan muttered something about handling investments. Lila promised to call. I smiled again, and this time it felt like breaking glass. When I finally stepped outside, the wind bit at my face. The world moved on as if nothing monumental had occurred. Yet everything had. I stood by the car, the envelope trembling in my hand. Somewhere inside that sealed paper was a message from the man I'd loved most of my life, a man who'd given our children millions and left me a mystery. And despite the ache, the confusion, the sting of betrayal, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever waited behind that key was meant only for me. I wasn't ready to open it yet, but I knew I would when I married Richard Lawson. I was 24, naive, and convinced love could outlast anything, time, money, even silence. He was already a man of means then, though he rarely spoke of it. What drew me wasn't his wealth but his steadiness, the quiet confidence that seemed to anchor every room he entered. For 3 decades, we built a life together, one of comfort, laughter, and eventually distance. It hadn't always been this way. In the early years, he'd surprise me with wildflowers from the roadside or a midnight drive just to watch the stars. But as his business grew, those gestures became rarer. Our conversations turned from dreams to logistics, from warmth to polite formality. I told myself this was what marriage became after decades, a gentle erosion disguised as routine. Our children, Evan and Lila, were born into privilege. Richard adored them in his quiet, methodical way, college funds before they could walk, trust accounts before their first jobs. I, on the other hand, gave them what money couldn't buy, time. Late-night talks, scraped knees bandaged with stories, and advice they'd one day call old-fashioned. They loved me, I think, but they admired him. Perhaps that was always the difference. After the will reading, the divide between us became something tangible. I saw it in the way they avoided my gaze, as though my presence was an uncomfortable reminder of what they'd rather not face. Maybe they pitied me, or maybe they were too relieved to question why their father had left me so little. That evening, I sat alone in Richard's study. The room smelled faintly of cedar and the cologne he used to wear. His desk remained untouched since the day he died, papers stacked with his usual precision, a photo of us from our honeymoon still framed beside the lamp. My fingers brushed the envelope resting on my lap, tracing the curve of his handwriting.
A key.
Just one. I turned it over, noticing the faint engraving along its handle. RL, his initials. Beneath the metallic sheen, I felt the echo of a memory. There had been a box once, small and oak-colored, that Richard kept locked in his home office. I'd asked him about it years ago. Just old papers, he'd said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Now, that small lie pulsed through my mind like a heartbeat. I rose, crossing the room to the lower cabinet, the one he'd always kept locked. The key trembled in my hand as I held it before the brass lock. It slid in effortlessly. My pulse quickened. For a moment I hesitated. Was I ready to know what he'd hidden all these years? The answer came in a whisper I barely recognized as my own. Yes. The lock clicked open, and the faint scent of old paper escaped. Inside, beneath a neat stack of files, lay a single photograph, one that shouldn't have existed. It was Richard, standing beside another woman, holding a child that wasn't ours. For a long moment, I simply stared at the photograph, unable to breathe. The edges were worn, its colors faded, but the image was unmistakable. Richard stood there, his arm around a woman I'd never seen before, her smile soft and familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. Between them, a young boy of maybe 5 or 6, grinning with the same half-dimple that Richard had passed on to Evan. The room seemed to tilt. My first instinct was denial. It couldn't be real. It must have been a business associate, a charity photo, something harmless. But deep down, I knew better. Richard had always guarded that locked drawer like it contained his soul. My fingers trembled as I pulled out a small envelope tucked beneath the photograph. Inside were several documents, bank statements, property deeds, and a birth certificate. The mother's name was Anna Porter. The father's name, in Richard's tidy signature, Richard Lawson. The boy's name, Samuel Porter Lawson. A cold wave washed over me. My husband, the man I'd shared 3 decades of my life with, had another child. I sank into his chair, the leather groaning beneath me, and pressed my palm against my chest as though to quiet the chaos inside. My mind began rewinding, missed calls, unexplained business trips, the way he'd sometimes stare out the window late at night, as if somewhere else entirely. I had mistaken those moments for fatigue, not guilt. When the phone rang, the sound sliced through the stillness like glass. I startled, the photograph slipping from my lap. It was Lila. Mom. Her voice was careful, hesitant. Are you okay? I just wanted to check in. I swallowed hard, forcing calm into my tone. I'm fine, darling. Just tired. There was a pause. You know, Dad loved you, she said quietly, as if she sensed the storm she couldn't name. I wanted to believe her, to hold on to the idea that love and betrayal could coexist. But the evidence on the desk whispered otherwise. After we hung up, I turned the key over in my hand again. Its purpose had been to open this drawer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was also meant to unlock something deeper, some truth Richard wanted me to face. I searched the rest of the drawer and found one final note, folded and yellowed at the edges. It was addressed to me. My breath hitched as I recognized his handwriting. If you found this, then you know. The first line alone was enough to make my throat tighten. I read the rest in silence, the words bleeding into my heart with each passing line. I never meant for you to find out this way. I thought I could protect you from my mistakes, from the man I was before I met you. But love, real love, doesn't erase the past. It only hides it until it demands to be seen. He wrote of Anna, of a time before me, and of a child he'd supported quietly for years. He wrote of guilt, of fear, of the love he carried for all of us in different, imperfect ways. By the time I reached the end, tears blurred the ink. The key is not just for the drawer, Emily. There's another lock you'll need to open. Find the cottage by the lake. You'll understand then. I sat in the dim study, the key clutched in my palm, the world suddenly smaller and infinitely larger all at once. My heart ached with betrayal, yet something inside whispered that this was only the beginning. The cottage, the lake, the truth that waited there. I wasn't sure I was ready to find it, but I knew I would. The lake lay just beyond the old cedar woods, where the trees grew close enough to swallow the road and hush the world into silence. I hadn't been there in years. Richard had bought the small cottage before our marriage and used to call it his thinking place. I'd visited only once, early in our relationship, when he'd shown me the quiet water and said it was where he went to make peace with himself. Back then, I hadn't understood what he meant. Now, as I turned the creaking key in the lock of the weathered front door, I began to. The air inside was heavy with dust and memory. The faint scent of cedar and tobacco still lingered, the way his clothes used to smell when he came home from long trips. I half expected to see him there, seated by the window, notebook open, head bowed in thought. But there was only stillness. On the small writing desk by the window sat a wooden box, its brass lock gleaming faintly. My pulse quickened. The same key, his final gift, fit perfectly. The lock gave with a soft click. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with twine, yellowed with age. My name was written across the first one in his familiar, slanted script. Emily, it began, if you are reading this, I am gone. I can only hope that time has softened the hurt I've caused. I never stopped loving you, not for a single day, but I must tell you the truth of the man you married. The words pulled at me like a tide. He wrote of Anna, the woman in the photograph, his first love, whom he had met before he ever knew me. Their relationship had ended abruptly after she disappeared, taking their child, Samuel, with her. For years he'd searched, haunted by the absence, until fate had brought me into his life. You were my redemption, he wrote, but I could never bury the part of me that still belonged to them. Tears burned as I read. He confessed that he had found Anna years later, terminally ill and raising their son alone. Out of guilt and a sense of duty, he'd helped them in secret, fearing that telling me would destroy what we'd built. I didn't want you to see me as a man divided, he wrote, so I became a man who lied. In the final paragraph, his tone shifted, softer, almost pleading. Samuel is grown now. I've left him what I could in quiet ways. But I wanted you to have something more than money, a chance to see who I really was. To forgive me if you can. The lake was always where I felt closest to the truth. Maybe it can offer you that, too. When I finished reading, I didn't cry. Not immediately. Instead, I walked outside, the letter trembling in my hand. The lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, still and vast, reflecting the emptiness and peace inside me all at once. I sat on the weathered dock, the breeze lifting my hair, and let the truth settle. Richard had betrayed me, yes, but he had also trusted me with the only thing that still mattered, the truth of his flawed, human heart. And for the first time since his death, I no longer felt like the woman left with nothing. I felt like the keeper of everything he couldn't say aloud. The following morning, I returned to the cottage before dawn. Mist hovered over the lake like a veil, blurring the horizon between water and sky. The world was still half asleep, and in that hush, I felt something shift, like grief itself was softening into something quieter, something I could live with. I carried Richard's letter in my coat pocket, its creases deepened from the night before. The words no longer burned. They simply were, truths that could neither be denied nor undone. For so long, I had defined my life by what Richard gave me, the house, the family, the sense of belonging. Now, standing by the lake he had once called his refuge, I realized what he had truly left behind was choice, the freedom to decide what his memory would mean to me. I sat on the weathered dock again, my reflection trembling in the water beside the fading stars. Somewhere out there was Samuel, Richard's other son, my son's half-brother. I didn't know his face beyond the faded photograph, but I could feel the thread connecting us. I wondered if he knew about me. About us. About the man we both loved in different, complicated ways. Part of me wanted to find him, to bridge the distance Richard's silence had built. Another part feared reopening wounds that might never heal. Forgiveness, I was beginning to understand, wasn't a single act. It was a slow unspooling, like the morning light creeping over the lake. When I returned home later that day, the house felt different, emptier, yet somehow lighter. Evan and Lila came by that evening, bringing flowers and hesitant smiles. They still didn't know what I had found, and I decided not to tell them, not yet. Some truths need time before they can be shared. As they talked about their plans, their new investments, their comfortable futures, I watched them with a strange mix of love and distance. They had their inheritance, their millions. But what I held was something neither of them could measure in numbers, a story, a secret, and the fragile peace that comes from knowing the full shape of a life once shared. That night, I framed the photograph, the one of Richard, Anna, and Samuel, and placed it inside the study drawer where his own portrait once stood. Not as a symbol of betrayal, but as acknowledgement. The man I loved had been imperfect, divided, but also deeply human. Before going to bed, I stood by the window and whispered into the quiet, "I forgive you." The words didn't erase the pain, but they settled like ripples on calm water, widening until they became part of the stillness itself. And for the first time since his death, I felt something close to peace, not because I understood everything Richard had done, but because I finally understood myself. In the end, the letter and the key had not been about unlocking a secret, they had been about unlocking me.